Donald Trump is trying to rig the 2026 midterm elections, but Democrats have found their footing and are fighting back. Today's guest, Jon Favreau, knows exactly what Democrats need to do. As President Obama's speechwriter and the host of the award winning Pod Save America, he has spent his career helping Democrats cut through the noise and inspire real change. In this interview, we will talk about Donald Trump's attack on democracy and elections and what Democrats need to do now. But first, subscribe to this channel to stay informed about how you can defend democracy. Jon Favreau, welcome to Defending Democracy.
Good to see you, Mark.
You are as close an observer of American politics as anyone. And before we move on to Donald Trump and the Republicans and all the terrible stuff they are doing, I have a bunch of questions I just want to ask you about Democrats. So to me, I see authoritarianism. I see threats to free and fair elections in 2026. I see literally like someone who wants to be a dictator and a king. A lot of other Democrats seem to see the same things, but think that, like, sure, Donald Trump is overreaching, but that I am overreacting. So I think I know which side of the line you fall on here. I think you're closer to mine, but put on
Yeah,
your observer hat. What is the disconnect going on in the Democratic Party?
sure. Yes, you're correct. I'm with you on this one. And here's I'll give the best side of the I'll give the best argument on the other side of this, which is most of the people in this country are not paying attention to politics, which is a problem we've had for quite a while now. The attention gap has been getting worse. You've got like somewhere around 15 to 20% of the country that is closely following the political news, and the rest is not, even though the rest still vote. So you got a big portion of the country that does vote but doesn't pay close attention to politics. For those people, they are thinking about what most tangibly affects my life. And so if ICE is not in your neighborhood, and if the decisions that Donald Trump is making and has made since January are not directly affecting you, or you don't know they're directly affecting you, then when some pollster calls and asks you what your top issues are, you're going to say, well, I'm trying to feed my family and make sure I can pay all the bills and make my mortgage and all that. And so those are my top concerns right now. And you're not necessarily thinking that all these other issues are your concerns. So in that sense, I understand it from a voter perspective,
Right. So do I.
but from a Democratic leader
This
perspective,
is my question. Right.
they see those polls and they think, okay, everyone's top priority is cost of living, affordability, healthcare, and we have an advantage on those issues over Republicans right now, and so we should press those advantages. And the way that we can get power back and stop Donald Trump is by appealing to people based on the issues that they care about the most, right? So that would be their argument, that if we want power, the best way to get power and to stop Donald Trump and to stop this authoritarian takeover is to appeal to people based on what they really care about. And look, I've been in focus groups, I've conducted them myself, like I get that. But I think when you tell people what's going on in the country, I think if you sat with people who weren't paying close attention and say, "Well, what do you think about what's a bigger concern to you? That your premiums are going to double, or that tomorrow when you go to work, you might be kidnapped by masked federal agents and not be able to call a lawyer or or talk to your family until they decide to let you go when they finally realize that you're a citizen." I think they'd probably say that that's worse than the premiums, even though they'd be pretty pissed about the premiums too.
Yeah. So you said something to Ezra Klein that I thought was really insightful and interesting, which is that, there are probably a large number of Senate Democrats, House Democrats. I can't remember exactly the frame you were referring to. It was in the context of the shutdown, in which you said that, look, it's not that you have these two positions and there's no middle ground, or there's no middle ground. Your position was that actually a large number of congressional Democrats, they actually think by focusing on healthcare and costs, it actually helps on the things I care about. So that it's not that they don't care about those things. It's just, so explain that theory, because I thought it was
Yeah.
actually a really insightful way of seeing it, other than this dichotomy that frankly I see it in the dichotomous world. But I heard you, and like you kind of persuaded me, at least for a while.
No, because I talked to a lot of these Democrats, and a lot of them are. So I think there's a big group of Democratic politicians who are very alarmed by everything that's happening. And they do not think that this is normal politics and that Donald Trump is just overreaching and that everything's going to be fine. Like they're worried. They also think that the best path towards a Democratic majority and a Democratic president in 2028 is to focus on the issues that people care about. And they actually don't know what else they can be doing to stop some of the more authoritarian impulses of Donald Trump. And, I had this debate during when they were contemplating a shutdown, like should they do a shutdown? Should the shutdown, if they do a shutdown, should it be about healthcare or should it be about, some of these authoritarian threats? And, I lost that one. And it's about
I'm pro focusing on the authoritarian
yeah,
threats.
like look, I get that some of it's hard, and I get that the more you make the shutdown demand something that constrains Donald Trump's power, the less likely they're ever going to agree to that. Like I get that, but I think we're already seeing right now that like yes, Democrats are winning the shutdown fight. Yes, healthcare, the salience of healthcare as an issue has been raised for sure, and most people want the ACA tax credits extended. Most people don't blame the Democrats for the shutdown. They blame Trump and the Republicans. So in that sense, we are winning. It's also faded from the headlines. And I don't think that's for lack of trying on behalf of the Democrats. I think the Democrats in Congress have been doing everything they possibly can to keep healthcare in the headlines. The challenge is Donald Trump is the president, and the big news, continues to be the fact that has masked armed agents in the streets, that he's militarizing our cities, that he is going after his political critics and people who disagree with him, and prosecuting them. Like that is the big story. And so to the extent that the media is covering those stories, to the extent that the Trump and the Republican Party are talking about those stories and that they want to make the news, like that is the news. And so, yes, the government is shut down, but it's probably the first time in my lifetime that a government shutdown hasn't been the lead of the top political news story every single day. And that's because Donald Trump is such a unique threat, and what he's doing is so uniquely dangerous in American history that I think that the media and people's attention are rightly focused on those things.
Yeah, and look, I agree with you. I think Democrats in Congress are actually doing a pretty good job with the messaging. And the fact that, by the way, that people blame Donald Trump and the Republicans a pretty good success story for the communications efforts around the shutdown. I mean, that's not easy for the out of power party to be able to get there. And healthcare does seem to be a really potent issue now and one that's growing. I guess my question is, you know, what's the back end of this look like? What does success look like here? I'll be right back with more of my conversation with Jon Favreau in a moment. But in 2020, I founded Democracy Docket to be an uncompromising voice in the fight for democracy, as well as a go to news source for free and fair elections. Now, 5 years later, our democracy is at a tipping point. Donald Trump is attacking free and fair elections, and Republicans are along for the ride. Well, the Democracy Docket team is growing to meet this moment, but it needs your support to help hold Donald Trump accountable. For just $10 a month, you'll get access to exclusive events, insights from me, and much, much more. Become a premium member now in the description below.
Well, I mean, substantively, right? Success looks like Republicans at some point say this is very unpopular, and extending the shutdown is unpopular. We're getting blamed. Extending the healthcare subsidies is popular. Let's just cut a deal. We'll do something that will save face. Maybe we'll promise a vote that we have to do, and we know it's going to pass. I don't know how it ends, right? But let's say that somehow Democrats win. So then the healthcare issue is, I wouldn't say it's entirely taken off the table, but the most potent issue is taken off the table for the midterms. And now we're moving on to something else. So good substantive win that's actually going to improve people's lives, make sure that their premiums don't double and triple. So that's a good win. Politically, and I guess the argument is, and my co-host Dan Pfeiffer has made this argument, that the people who vote Democrat or people who are thinking about voting Democrat will have seen that the Democratic Party stood up and fought for something in terms of healthcare and making sure that we stop a premium hike, and that people will credit Democrats for finally standing up and fighting for something, and they will remember that come the midterms when it's time to come out and vote. The challenge with that is, will people remember that by the time the midterms come around? There's going to be like about a billion news cycles between now and then, and unfortunately, probably a whole bunch of other awful shit that Donald Trump does. So, I don't know. And then there's also a chance that the Republicans and Donald Trump just say, he's governing like a king anyway. Who does he really need Congress? And maybe they're fine playing this game of chicken, and they'll keep the government closed as long as they need to.
Yeah. By the way, do you and Dan ever sit around and think, for all the shit we got about the Affordable Care Act and Obamacare from the left and the right, it's now actually like literally the most popular thing there is on the left and the right. I mean, sometimes, look, I'm gonna like reveal that I was an Obama person, as you know, in 2008 and 2012, and then I worked for Hillary Clinton in 2016, and like it felt like for this long period of time, all there were people running for president on both sides, shitting all over Obamacare. And
Yeah.
literally, it is now the most popular thing there is. So do you like when the microphones are off, like be like, huh, we were right?
Uh, you would think so, but the way I am, I take that as next time Democrats pass a gigantic piece of legislation that we believe is important and that we also think will be popular, we have to implement it faster and even better, and make sure that people feel the effects of it sooner, so that we're not fighting about it for 10 years and trying to fight to save it for 10 years. So anyway,
Yeah.
but yeah, it's
Okay.
good. It's a good thing.
Yeah, but okay, so you brought me to the topic that I really want to talk about, which is that it does feel like the shutdown has energized Democrats to feel like they can actually fight, and for elements of their supporters, their base, like there is, I think, a greater sense now that Democrats have more footing. And I look to California and what they're doing with redistricting. And I wonder, and I'm going to lay this out, this is a base case, and you can tell me why it's wrong. I wonder if this California redistricting initiative that's going to be voted on November 4th isn't actually the next logical step in that, because for years and years, as going back to your beginning point, which is pollster calls you on the phone, you've never thought about these issues before, or you haven't given a lot of thought to them, or you're in a focus group and you get asked questions, and someone says, what do you think of nonpartisan redistricting? Oh, love that. What do you think of politicians drawing map? Hate that, right? And so Democrats have been sort of very much within this very narrow 40 to 40 yard line on a lot of these process reform issues, these democracy reform issues. And what's interesting about the California situation is when Gavin Newsom first proposed drawing more seats, I was actually among the skeptics and were like, you know what? They should just do it through the legislature, because like that's the only way you're going to get this done. That would have been even more complicated, but we'll set that aside. But the idea of making this a referendum actually, to me, has proved that where you have big money litigating this position on both sides, right? You have certainly plenty of popular politicians and money saying to pass this change, but you also have big money and people like Arnold Schwarzenegger saying don't pass this. That actually, like, it's looks like it's going to pass by a pretty wide margin, which is good, knock on wood. But that actually, it also shows that Democrats can organize themselves around these democracy issues on what I think of as substantive democracy. In other words, like what the outcomes are democratic, as opposed to just like keeping themselves sort of bound up in pollster knots about the process democracy.
I, s- I I think that's true in a couple different ways. I think in California, I I was actually pretty hopeful from the beginning that this would pass by a good margin, and again, knock on wood. Um, and this is why it is an off-year election, and the people who show up in an off-year election, particularly an off-year election here in California, where there's only one ballot initiative on the ballot, and there's not statewide races for electeds that anyone's voting for, that the people who are going to show up, the electorate that will show up for that, are going to be like highly engaged people who pay a lot of attention to the news, and those people especially pay a lot of attention to national political news. I mean, most political news has become nationalized now anyway, but especially the people who show up in an off-year elections are going to do that. And Democrats have a huge voter registration advantage in California. So you got a bunch of like people who are like Democracy Docket subscribers, Pod Save America listeners, like all the people who listen to us, like these are the Californians who are going to show up and mail their ballots back in on this, right? So I do think that we have an advantage there. But to your broader point about these process reforms, this is why I've always been like banging the drum on the filibuster for years now. Is like I think there are some um, issue positions that if Democrats go too far left or even too far right and center, like they're going to lose people in the party because or lose potential voters because people have thought about these issues. Most people in the country don't really give a shit about process issues. They care less about arcane Senate procedure and the filibuster and same thing with redistricting and stuff like that than they do about outcomes and wanting to have a government that does stuff that makes their lives better. And so if people learn that, like, oh, well, yes, in theory, nonpartisan redistricting sounds great, but do I want do I want one party control of Congress in perpetuity? No, I don't think that. Even if you're not a Democrat, right? Even if you're independent, that doesn't seem fair. That doesn't seem great to have one party control everything in perpetuity. Or if I keep sending people to the Senate and keep trying to vote for a Democratic Senate or vote for a Republican Senate, and then nothing gets done because there's this thing called the filibuster, do I care about the filibuster? No, I want legislation to get passed to improve my life. So I do think that we Democrats in Washington sometimes worry more about how voters are going to feel about these process issues than they care about actually just getting shit done. And I think most voters in the country right now, of all parties, and especially Democrats and independents, especially people who don't turn out into a lot of elections, their big problem with Washington is not that someone's breaking procedure or changing a rule. Their problem is that nothing seems to be getting done, and they want something to get done. I think honestly that was part of Trump's appeal to people outside his base, to the extent that he got some voters outside of his base, is they're like, yeah, I don't like the guy. I think he's an asshole, but I'm sick of nothing getting done, and he seems like he's going to do stuff. So Democrats should, change rules to help us do stuff.
Yeah, and so, I think that it is not a coincidence that after this started looking so good in California, that you now see Virginia, for example. What they're planning on in Virginia is literally they are going to essentially they're going to hijack an open special session, okay, that Glenn Youngkin called, but it never got adjourned. Okay, so like it was for some other thing, but it never got adjourned. So they're going to use that to then pass a repeal of the nonpartisan redistricting process in this legislative session. Then there'll be a governor's election in a few weeks, or a few days now, and all the legislative seats will be up. Democrats presumably take control of the governor's mansion, hold both houses of the legislature. Then they immediately call a new session and pass it a second time, because in order to repeal it has to be passed in two different sessions. So session number one, hijacked old special session. Number two, special session or new session in the new year. Then it goes on the ballot 90 days later, and it can pass. And all of a sudden you have, out of what was a belief that nothing could be done in Virginia, this very, very clear path, albeit with a lot of moving pieces. And I just, it makes me think, like, okay, Democrats, we've figured this out. Like, it's actually about the outcome. It's not about whether if you described that to someone, no doubt on a poll, they'd be like, well, that doesn't seem right. But if you describe to them the outcome, then everyone's like, yeah, this makes perfect sense.
Yes, for sure. And, there was some concern, that some people voiced at the beginning of when Newsom was first talking about doing this, that, well, then don't we look like hypocrites?
Right.
And we were all for non-part. And it's like, I see the answer to that is very easy as well, which is like, we introduced the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. Included in that legislation is nationwide independent redistricting. If Republicans want to sign on to that, we're happy to.
Yeah.
And if they don't want to do that, we're not going to unilaterally disarm. That's crazy, and most people understand that's crazy.
Yeah, and in fact, we just for the record, we Democrats passed in the House the Freedom to Vote Act, the For the People Act, and the John R. Lewis Voting Rights
Right,
Advancement
right.
Act.
Yeah, I always forget it's all of them.
And in each instance, it got every single Democratic vote and not a single Republican vote. Not a single Republican. I don't know who this guy Kiley is in California, but I wish if he's listening, because maybe he watches, maybe he listens to you guys, but where the fuck were you when Texas was doing this? If you were so upset, he's a Republican member who I guess is going to lose his seat, and he's saying how terrible it is the
Yeah.
Democrats are doing this in California, and I'm like, how come you didn't lobby Texas not to do it? Right? I mean, if the California Republicans are so upset, they could have stopped this, right? If I mean,
Yeah.
but where were they?
No, they're these people. I used to think that the reason that they're so enthralled to Donald Trump and will do whatever he says is because they're desperate to keep their jobs. But for a lot of the Republicans in the House who are in blue states, it seems like they don't even care about their jobs. they I guess what they care more about is like, I have a job in Congress that I'm going to get, my seat's going to get eliminated and I'm not going to go back to Congress, but if I suck up to Trump and MAGA, then maybe I'll be an influencer, or I'll get a job on Fox, or I'll get a job somewhere else in the party, or Donald Trump will make me an ambassador somewhere. Who
Okay,
knows?
one other question about Democrats, and then I do want to turn to Republicans. So, one of I think the best books. I won't ask you for your favorite books, by the way. Like,
I was gonna say,
this is
yeah.
very low
I
stakes
have to
blood
really
pressure
think
stuff.
about that ahead of time.
But what I thought that Chris Hayes's book on the attention economy was really good.
Excellent.
And I wonder if part of what you are saying about, like, you know, Democrats are doing a really good job, and I agree with you. And I want everyone to be clear. I think Democrats deserve a lot of credit for what they're doing in the House and Senate right now on the healthcare issue. They are hammering it, and they are winning that issue. But what I think what what you're saying is, like, getting the attention is like if you don't have the attention, then the rest of it actually doesn't matter. And so, you are kind of you've been a speechwriter for a president, which is about as conventional establishment way of communicating as possible, using whereases and therefore, great land, language. And now you are, a bona fide media sensation, in sort of straddling both, podcasting, video on YouTube, and influencer, and all of that. And so, what is your advice to Democrats, again, at the candidate and politician level? What's your advice to them about how to straddle those worlds between the I rise to speak in favor of my colleague, on the one hand, and on the other hand,
Yeah.
getting attention?
Yeah. My first piece of advice is don't do that. It's funny you mentioned Chris. He's on my other podcast offline this week talking about his latest piece in the New York Times about what Democrats need to do to get more attention. So we have a whole conversation about this. So it's fresh on my mind. I think the Democrats' problem right now is that they seem like they're always reading the stage directions, and so they are looking at the polls, not just the polls, but they are like reading the punditry, listening to the punditry, like us, and listening to strategists and being like, okay, this is what people care about, so I got to talk about this and I got to do it in this language. And there is still this way of speaking that really politicians in both parties have had forever, where you are, your public persona and the way you speak in public is very, very, very different than the way you speak in private. And there was a time and a place for that for many, many decades. I think the way the information environment has changed now is that people are so used to going on their phones and their screens and seeing people talk to them like they talk to people in their life, right? And that it's more informal, it's casual, and so when you are used to seeing that all the time, and also, by the way, that's how Donald Trump talks, for better or worse, mostly worse. Um, and so when you see a politician that is talking like, I hereby rise this, that, and the other thing, or we're going to grow the economy from the bottom up and the middle up, just like things that don't make sense to normal people, you're going to stop paying attention to that person. Or you're going to keep scrolling, or it's not going to land with you. It's not going to, because it just feels different and phony and odd. And I think that Democratic politicians, and this goes for people on the left, on the center left, whoever, um, you just have to narrow the space between the way you speak in public and the way you speak in private. You're never the distance is never going to be zero, obviously, but to the extent that you can narrow that as much as possible, you should. And I also think, when was working for Obama, he taught me a lot about communicating and writing, and the most important thing he taught me was communicating and giving speeches and communicating as a politician is fundamentally about telling stories. That is how we are persuaded. That is how we remember things. That is how we are emotionally moved, is through story. And that can be, both the story of like, I met someone who did X, Y, and Z, but it's also just when you're telling a friend a story, when you're trying to tell someone something funny, like, you think about the beginning and the middle and the end, you add some drama to it, like, this it's just the way you talk to people, and I worry today that a lot of politicians have internalized, like, "Okay, so to get attention, I have to do the latest TikTok trend that my Gen Z staff is telling me about, or I have to swear more because I hear that's cool, or I have to have, like, an applause line that's gonna, like, really get people applauding." And I just think that once you're down on the tactics of communication, you already have skipped past the most important thing, which is, what do I want to communicate? And, like, what is the best way to communicate that message in a way that I would want to do if I was at a bar talking to a friend, if I was at a restaurant, if I was just having dinner with someone? Like, what is the most dramatic, compelling way to tell that story? And I just wish more Democrats would do that.
So let me ask you a question about Obama specifically,
Hmm.
because you were his chief speechwriter. For people who don't know, John worked hand in glove with President Obama in as both as senator, I think, and also as
Hmm.
president, and was involved in the creation of so many of Obama's great speeches. One of his great skills was, though, the ability to inspire.
Yeah.
I mean, at his best, he didn't sort of lower um, his um, speeches to the common vernacular. Like, there was this sense of you felt when you listened to him, like you were listening to someone who was bringing out the better in you, and the was raising politics up. And I'm curious, are you saying that you don't think just works anymore in 2025, or he was a uniquely talented orator, and therefore, but like other, hey, the rest of you senators and congressmen, you're not Barack Obama, or is there a place for that in today's politics?
So there's definitely a place for it. I think it's depending on the setting, right? Like, I think if you are at a rally in front of thousands of people, or you're at the convention, right? Yeah, that's the place for that. But I also think that you can inspire and lift people up in quieter settings, even if you don't have an audience in front of you. Again, through, like, really compelling, inspiring stories. I even think about, we did that, the speech when he won in 2008 that he gave in Chicago that night. We ended that speech with a story about a woman. Her name is Ann Nixon Cooper, and she was like, she waited in line in Atlanta that day. I saw it on CNN, and like, as I was trying to figure out what we were gonna do, if he wins, what's gonna be the ending of the speech, and I see this story on CNN about this woman who waited in line for 3 hours to vote, and she was like 105 years old, and I thought to myself, like, first of all, now we look back at that and we're like, Why was she waiting in line for 3 hours? Like, what's wrong with our electoral system?" Of course, but the fact that she did that, was really inspiring, and I thought, oh, that's a good way we can use that story, but we can also weave in everything she's seen through her 100 years on this planet and all the progress she's seen along the way. Because when she was born, she couldn't vote because she was a woman and because she was black, and so that was the whole ending of the speech. But that's an example of, like, you can tell that story without a lot of, like, flowery rhetoric or soaring oratory, and still it can be very compelling and moving just because the story itself is powerful. And so I do think that, um, like, there's even the all the talk about healthcare, since the government has been shut down. There's been a lot of statistics about healthcare. There's been a lot of, like, what would happen to people's premiums, and there hasn't been a lot of just talking straight to camera or about the people who are being affected and people who are, like, really scared, and stories. Like, I think that you have to make politics fundamentally about the people that you're trying to help, and you need to put those people at the center of not just your politics and your policy, but the way you communicate to other people, because, like, that's what inspires people, And we've been, I, because immigration was an issue where a lot of Democrats at first did not want to talk about immigration, did not want to talk about the ICE raids because they said, "Oh, that's Donald Trump's best issue." Well, when you start humanizing and dramatizing these stories of these people who are being snatched off the street, and the families that they're leaving behind, and the people who are trying to help them and what they're going through, that really, I mean, we found that here, and we do a lot of these stories as well. That really resonates with people. in a way that cuts through how whatever feelings they may have had on the issue of immigration. So that's what I wish more politicians would do.
Okay, so you mentioned the 103 or the 100-year-old, I forget how old she was, who waited in line to vote. And I've been actually waiting to raise this with you. If you've never listened to Raphael Warnock's acceptance speech in the Senate,
Mhm.
he also talked about voters waiting in long lines. But talked about it as a tragedy for democracy, talked about the problems of democracy. Not, it was the voters in his story were both inspirational, but also the victims of a system. Now, in fairness to President Obama, he actually in 2012 or following 2012 appointed a blue ribbon commission,
Mm.
bipartisan, chaired by Bob Bauer and Ben Ginsberg, to
Yeah.
study the problem of long lines. And they did tremendously important work. And it's work that, frankly, more people should have picked up. But here we are now in 2025. And it feels like, long lines are still a problem, but they are not the worst of the problems we are facing as we head towards 2026. And I've been very outspoken and said, look, we're going to have elections because dictators love elections. What they don't like is free and fair elections. And
Yeah.
so the question for 2026 is, how free and fair they will be. And I think that by any objective measure, they will be less free and fair than they were in 2024 or 2022. The question is by how much? And I'm curious, A, if you agree with that, to the extent you have sort of a formed view on that. And then second, there has been this debate within the Democratic Party about how much to talk about that. To what extent does talking about these things perhaps inadvertently suppress the vote versus where I live is like voters are seeing the troops in the streets, like they are aware that Donald Trump is trying to do a mail-in voting. Like I'm not telling them anything different than they know. What I'm trying to tell them is that there are people fighting for them and that there will be people in their corner to try to make sure that the system is as fair for them as possible and to give them a reason to turn out. How do you see this?
Well, on the prediction front, I don't know, and I'm certainly worried about it. I share your concern about it, and I don't put anything past Donald Trump at this point. Um, I was at a fundraiser last night, and someone asked, like, Steve Bannon was telling The Economist that Donald Trump is going to have a third term, and what do you think about that? And I was like, well, here's the thing: maybe, maybe not. But the question for all of us is, how will we act differently if we knew that he is going to try for a third term or he's not going to try for a third term? And I think the same is true about the midterms, right? Like, how are we going to act differently if we think, he is going to try to rig the midterms or he's not? I mean, he's already trying with the maps, but, once we get to the vote count. And I, where I really agree is that the ideal outcome here is that there is such a backlash
Right.
among the public for the what he is trying to do and what he is trying to threaten and intimidate ahead of the midterms, whether it's troops in the street, whether it's getting his wacko election denialists that he's now appointing to all kinds of positions in government to look back at the 2020 election so that they can have an excuse to seize voting machines again, whatever it may be. It's like, as the Trump people said in 2024, too big to rig. Um, you you want the backlash and to tell people, like, they are trying to steal your vote. They are trying to stop you from voting. They are trying to take away your voice. Do not let them. And in that sense, I think if we're talking about it with that in mind and in that way, I think it's good to talk about it. I think if we talk about it like it's going to happen, we're screwed, he's going to rig the elections, this is bad, then there is a risk of suppressing the vote. And so I just think you need both parts to the message that, like, yes, this is a real threat. And that's why so many of us need to come out.
Yeah, look, and also that, Donald Trump wants us to be hopeless. Donald Trump wants
Yep.
us to believe that he's all powerful. And we can't give him that. And the
Nope.
fact is that he is not all powerful. And, it's not a foregone conclusion that he's going to succeed at doing what he's trying to do. And that, and the other thing is he's very, he and his movement are actually very fragile in the sense that when there is pushback, the whole Trump always chickens out is actually, I think, not just a trade issue. It is a people push back on him, he tends to not want to pick that fight, but rather go someplace where people won't, which is, I think, why he's gone after some of the big legacy media outlets.
Yep. I agree with that. I agree with that, and that's why I don't fault people in the country for saying, it's been 10 years and I'm exhausted and I can't pay attention to this all the time. Like I hope they don't. I hope they change their behavior, but I like empathize with that. I don't empathize with almost any of the elites who have given in, because like you people, you live comfortable lives. You've been given a lot of power, and with that comes certain obligation and responsibility, not just to yourself and your bottom line, but to the country that made your success possible. And also like when people, I mean, this is why I think the Kimmel thing was a big deal, even though it's like, oh, he's a comedian and he's got a show in Hollywood, and people sort of treated it as like a whatever. But like Jimmy Kimmel standing up and breaking through the noise of every single day. We were just talking about attention, and like there's a million headlines a day. Well, here's this guy who does have an audience and is nationally known, and he stands up to Trump, and he comes back onto the air and he kicks his ass. He doesn't cower at all. And like I think that probably gives some other people somewhere, whether it's in the entertainment industry, whether it's beyond, a little more courage the next time Donald Trump comes after them. And I wish there'd be a lot more people who acted like that.
Yeah. So this was the last topic I needed to go over with you, because in addition to brilliant speechwriter, in addition to award-winning podcast host, you are also probably, along with Tommy and Dan and your ever-growing, John, your
The
ever-growing
Empire.
group there. You're also probably the most successful builders of pro democracy media. You probably will use a different term. You may say independent media, whatever. But we are watching the collapse of linear television. I mean, that much is clear. I would argue that we are watching the collapse more broadly of legacy media, and in that I include many of the major daily newspapers. And I'm not talking about the ones we lament that are facing troubles like at the local level. But look at the LA Times, for
Yep.
example, in your where you are, or the Washington Post, right? These are outlets that are just sort of falling apart because of business decisions that they've made, and a lot of them center around Trump. And I'm just curious, because I hear a lot of different people. I just heard Sarah Longwell from the Bulwark talk about this in an interview. What do you think the sort of future of media is around news and politics?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is going to be more. It's obviously going to be more diffuse. There's going to be many more outlets, of just many more independent creators and independent journalists and people. Whether you're on Substack, whether you're starting podcast on their own. At some point, I think that there's going to be so many that there's going to be sort of a need for some kind of consolidation and just for curation purposes, because I think people are going to face too many choices and not know where to turn. I think we are fortunate that we had like a bit of a first mover advantage in
And you're all
the
incredibly talented.
well,
Yeah,
but
that
like
advantage too. I
when
mean, let's be
well
clear.
when it was 2017 and there weren't like a ton of political news podcasts out there, and I do think now there's a ton of podcasts in the market. Like it's hard to start new podcasts, right? So I think at some point there's going to be some kind of consolidation there, but I think we are moving towards a model where individual news consumers, are going to want to pay for the news that they consume, right? And so I think like the like more people are going to subscribe to news. I think that hopefully the ad-supported model of of news, especially in podcasts, that's what supports a lot of us, is sustainable for a while. But I do think as people build, as independent media companies, independent journalists sort of build out audiences. So the most important thing is like building that trust with the audience, so that A, they keep consuming the news, B, are willing to pay for it, so that the news gathering and everything else costs a lot of money. And then also not just a relationship where they're listening and consuming news and paying for it, but that they're part of the community, right? Like we have a lot of people, and I know you guys do too. Like we have a lot of people who they listen and we get feedback from them and we see them at shows and they like doing this and like listening to us because it's part of a community for
Right.
them and they get to meet other listeners at shows or wherever and keep us out of it, right? Like there's just like people who are Podsave listeners like meet up and hang out. And so I think that's really important because I do think that we have lost sort of this monocultural environment, particularly in the media, and people. What hasn't changed is people's need for connection and community, and I do think that both political movements and sort of media organizations that figure out how to give people that sense of community and connection are going to succeed.
And how do you think about the different channels? You guys are literally like the 800-pound gorilla on podcasting. And so, and Scott Galloway has talked a lot about this, that, the handful of very large podcasts, yours included, command so much of the advertising dollars that like you all, I think, are going to be just fine with whatever the future brings. But then you have like the rise of Substack. You obviously have YouTube being now a larger and larger presence, including in podcasting. Spotify now has video podcasting, I guess, sort of a hybrid, both ad supported and now also kind of competing a little bit with YouTube. Like, how do you guys think about this? Do you think about it mostly just through the lens of the podcast, or do you think about it in those multimodals? You're obviously, you guys are also phenomenally successful on the road in shows. And by the way, Crooked Con is coming up, and I personally can't wait. I'm going to be there,
I'm so
and
excited. It'll
yeah,
be good
no,
to.
so I'm super excited about that. But like, how do you think about all of those different distribution?
Yeah, we spent a lot of time over the last year or two really building up YouTube, our YouTube audience, and that we are now on Substack as well. And so we're trying to be on all the platforms. What I've found, what I really like about YouTube is the search for podcasts. Like when you're actually searching for topics, it's not great. It's never been great. It's not great on Apple. It's like a little better on Spotify, but it's still not great. And YouTube is different because the algorithm will surface, like if you're just searching for something that's in the news, the algorithm's more likely to surface a Pod Save America episode on YouTube that is covering that issue. So we've been focused on really building up, and we were a little late to that, but now we're sort of catching up on building up our YouTube audience because also like that, especially with YouTube, like that is the way people are consuming TV. Like that's going to replace TV. I mean, it already has for most people, and so it is funny how like just television news is being reinvented through like originally people who we our first pitch, Tommy and Lovett and I, was for we like went around Hollywood trying to pitch a television show
Really?
that was like Pod Save America before Pod Save America existed, just like us talking politics. And everyone was like, I don't just know if that's going to work and it doesn't fit for TV. And the TV model for news and talking about politics is like people in boxes sitting behind a desk and all that kind of stuff. And this seems too casual and all that. And now all these places that started as podcasts are now filmed and now they're on YouTube. And so now we've like now reinvented television, which we already had. And so I do think that YouTube's going to be big. And then I don't know if this is just me, we're older, but like I don't want to give up on written material, right? Like I like reading stuff. I don't want to just watch everything, and I still think, and I'm hoping that younger generations feel the same way, which is why I'm so hopeful about being on Substack now as well.
You get a lot of comments from people who, even if they're not hopeless, they feel powerless. And there's a difference between those two, right? They
Yeah.
can not be hopeless but not know what to do. Like they can feel fundamentally like they are listening to your content. They're watching you, they're reading you, but they're not really sure that they can make a difference. Like they understand how you can make a difference, they don't understand how they can make a difference. So what is your advice when people come up to you or people ask you that question? Like what can, as we say in politics, what can an everyday American do?
Yeah, and I think there's such a good question, and I think there's such a the good news is there's a range of things you can do that go from like, run for office, right? But say you're like, I can't run for office.
Right.
Well,
People, right.
yeah, then it's like, well, are you registered to vote? Yes, I'm going to vote. Well, then what else can I do? Do you want to volunteer? Yes, okay, I can volunteer. Well, what if I don't have a lot of time to volunteer? It's like, well, we all have platforms now. We like everyone, you all have social media accounts, you all have social circles, friends, family, networks. Like I think spending time talking to your social circle about politics, the people you know, and trying to make sure that they tell 5 friends about an election that's coming up. Or if there's not an election coming up, here are some really scary things happening. And here's a story that you might not have seen, and maybe you should share that with people in your social circle as well. Like, I do think that those networks are becoming more powerful and more effective than even like knocking on random doors and phone banking to people who might not pick up the phone anymore. It's known as relational organizing in the business, but there's literally something for everyone to do. We always send people to votesaveamerica.com. That is sort of our one-stop shop for you can figure out how to volunteer, to donate money, but it's interesting. Our team at Vote Save America came to us, with an idea, and they're like, hey, we're going to have this initiative where we're going to ask people to we're going to try to recruit people to run for office, and we're just going to start in like 3 of these states that we need. So we started in like Arizona and Georgia, right? We started with a couple states, and I remember John and Tommy and I were like, if people are already listening to the show, like, do we really think there's a bunch of our listeners who haven't thought about running for office and are suddenly going to hear that this program's out there and they're going to run? We were like skeptical, and Shaniqua McClendon, who runs Vote Save America, and the team, they were like, we feel good about this. And we started the initiative, and within weeks, we had like a couple thousand people
Wow.
who signing up to run for office.
Wow.
And I know, and I was about him like, and Amanda Littman and Run for Something have been doing a
I was going to
fantastic job
say,
with
yeah,
that,
you should
and
connect with Amanda.
and we've worked with them as well on this, and like just the I never want to underestimate the willingness out there of people to get involved in politics. And I also think it's contagious, because I think when you hear, oh, a bunch of people who have just been listeners to a show for a while are suddenly now signing up to run for office. Maybe I can sign up to run for office. Maybe volunteering isn't so hard. Maybe I can go volunteer. Like, I think it's contagious. And so what we try to do, and what I tell people is, like, it is a very scary time. It is a dark time, and I get how it can feel, like you said, not hopeless, but you kind of feel powerless. But you don't have to take too many steps to start feeling the confidence from taking that step to then take another and to do more. And the most important way to, what makes you feel even better is doing that in community. Like,
Right.
we've all been through the pandemic. Everyone spends too much time behind our computers, on our screens. And the best part about doing these live shows, and one of the reasons I'm so excited about CrookedCon and all of us finally getting together, who've all been interviewing each other on shows for the last however many years, is there is something different about being together in person. And that was the same thing with the No Kings rallies, right? You get out there and you see other people who think like you and are scared like you and are hopeful like you, and you start making connections, and you're like, you know what? This wasn't just an important thing to do. This was a joyful thing to do, and it makes me want to do more of it. So that's what I try to tell people.
You are entirely right. Like, the when I first heard there was going to be Crooked Con and it was going to be in Washington D.C., I was excited. Then I was fortunate enough to be invited to be a part of it, and I'm really looking forward to that. But then something really interesting happened, which is that other people who I have been, as you say, interviewing, people who I text with, who I share ideas with, they're all going to be there. And like, so
Yeah.
we're all now planning to like meet up at like Crooked Con and like, sort of talk about like, where we should have coffee and, what's going
Yeah.
on what other panels are going on. And so it's a really, I mean, at the level of people who do this work, it's like an enormous public service you're doing. I mean, it's like an enormous public service. But talk about it, probably for our audience's standpoint, less what it's doing for people like me and others. Like, tell everyone what's going to be there and why they should find this exciting too.
Yeah, I mean, so we're gonna do a live show. We haven't done one in a while, I think since the election. In DC the night before on Thursday night. That'll be like a typical Pod Save America live show, and then on Friday, CrookedCon. We basically have like a day full of conversations. We have a whole bunch of different panels. I'm leading a panel on, it's called What's the Story? We're going to talk about messaging with some of the smartest strategists who've been on campaigns in the party. Dan's going to do one on polling. Tommy's going to do one on foreign policy. You're going to be on, I believe we're doing one on
Voting rights and voter integrity. Yeah.
voting rights and voter integrity. We're also doing, I think I'm also leading one on fighting back and some of the basically the threats. The now we added this one because Stephen Miller and company was like, we're coming after all of the left leaning groups and calling them Antifa. So we're going to do a panel on that. And basically, we're just having these conversations in front of everyone who comes to CrookedCon, so that hopefully, a lot of the conversations that people have online, which tend to be not as productive, or even the conversations that people just have on podcasts like this, we can have in person, and we can have with a whole bunch of people, and then we can have an audience listen. And hopefully when people leave CrookedCon, they are energized to keep fighting and to get involved and to get their friends involved. And they have some, good ideas on where the party should go from here and where the pro-democracy movement, more importantly, should go from here.
Well, and so I hope everyone in the Washington, D.C. area, if you have not already, I hope you sign up. I hope you go to CrookedCon. I hope you go to the live show. I hope you go to the panels. And by the way, when you go to the panels, come to the one that I'm on, because I want to I
Come
want
to
to
Mark's
impress these
panel.
guys.
It's going to be great.
I want to make sure that, like, we get good feedback. Uh, so because this way they'll invite me back the next time.
CrookedCon.com is the website. We have limited tickets left, and so sign up to come see Mark.